Right now, we are welcoming our editor-at-large, John Kingston, who is one of 3 Great Freightways representatives at the Mid-America Trucking Show this week. John, thanks for joining us, and I know you guys just got to the show yesterday, so not a whole lot to report on it yet, but I've got to ask, what are you most excited about to come out of this week?
Well, I'm just glad to be here. I've never been to a match show, and I'm with a couple of other people who haven't, Clarissa Hawes and Grace Sharkey. They also have never been to match. And of course, this is the first one in 3 years. So we're both excited. We're all three of us excited to be here. I'm doing this from a little cubicle in the press room, and I know I look like I'm hiding from the police right now. But it's actually a very big press room, but I didn't want to do this interview in front of everybody. So I hope to get out on the floor a little more today.
And speaking of conferences, you've been just traveling all over. You were at TCA conference earlier this week as well. And that one came out with some obviously really exciting showcases and product launches, but also with some pretty exciting information and some interesting conversations in the industry. You put one story up about one of those conversations you had. Let's dig into that a little bit for today's top story.
Yeah, there was I did 3 stories or almost 4 stories out of there about new product launches, but we'll put that aside. But yeah, the one that I did was basically a discussion of carriers to shippers, and the first part of the session was sort of very typical stuff. It was a representative from Home Depot, a representative from Cummins, which of course builds the engines that the carriers use in the trucks, but he was on the panel as somebody who is a shipper of products, and somebody from Covenant. And, the first part of it was all the kind of usual stuff about, well, here's what you need to do to be a good shipper. Here's what you need to do to be a good carrier. And then there was some questions from the audience, including from a guy named John Piper, who's very well known in this business. And he got into the question of why do you need annual bid rounds? If you're very happy with a shipper, if a shipper is very happy with a carrier, why do you go through the process of having an annual bid round? Which I thought was a legitimate question. The answers that came back were along the lines of, first of all, you can get stagnant with somebody and they kind of need to be pushed. Competition is always good. The power of incumbency is very strong, and that an incumbent in a contractual relationship would not be at the same starting point as somebody who didn't have that deal. So to the point that being an incumbent does matter. The fact that you provide a good service for all that time does matter. So I think that that was a really good point, and one of the shippers, I can't remember which one, made the point that a lot of the carriers actually like being in the competition again because it gives them an opportunity to maybe go for some new business. It gives them an opportunity to kind of hone the previous contract, and so clearly no indication that they were going to go away from it. But the point also was made that not only do the incumbents have an advantage in the competition, but they usually tend to win it. I mean, as long as they're providing good service, they will be stuck with.
And John, when you're looking at, of course, providing that good service is one thing, but when market really shifts and the industry shifts where, power is more in the hands of the carriers versus the shippers, which it's traditionally was years before, do you see any kind of market shifts in how some of these relationships are going to be handled?
Well, going back to what Tony said and going back to what our CEO, Craig Fuller, wrote yesterday, it looks like we may be in the middle of one of those shifts. And Craig tweeted out, and I guess JP Hampstead, our colleague, also tweeted out that a lot of brokers are saying that Monday was the best day they've ever had because I guess spot rates were falling. They already had contracted rates at higher numbers. And when you did the margin just on a day, they could walk away from a one-day profit loss statement and say, this is like one of the greatest days we've ever had. So when you see something like that, you can see that the first beneficiaries of a changing market are probably the brokers. And then, yes, as time goes on, the move will be to the shippers. And, when I joined Freightways in 2018, that was a really strong freight market. And you started to wonder, there was all sorts of talk about, well, this will permanently change things, particularly in the question of detention, because shippers are going to want to be a shipper of choice. They're going to want carriers, particularly independent owner operators, to come there. They don't want to have to wait for hours in detention. And, that's going to shift the dynamic. Well, by 2019, the freight market was kind of in the doldrums, and I don't think anybody was talking about any kind of permanent change having taken place out of 2018. So, then you get this incredible freight market of latter 2020, all through 2021, and now maybe starting to fade a little bit in 2022. So we will get a test about whether things things are really, truly different. When you get a buyer-seller relationship for anything, memories are short. I still remember early in my career covering the metals market and talking to a guy who was a beleaguered seller of nickel. And he said, well, when I get some of these, when things turn around, I get some of these steel makers in here, boy, I'm going to really squeeze their necks. I don't know if he ever really got to that point again, but you can see that whole debate about who's got the power, shippers versus carriers, or buyers versus sellers in general, has been going on a long time.
John, I know you typically don't cover the digital space and the digitization of freight matching or brokering, but I'm interested in if this conversation of the panel that you watched touched on any of that at all when it comes to the annual bid cycle or to the carrier-shipper relationship. We talk a lot about how when you're looking at automating your processes, do you lose that human touch? And I think that human touch can also be pretty crucial in winning that business back, even on an annual bid cycle. Was there any conversation about that?
I'm sorry to interrupt. Yeah. No, clearly, I mean, one of the discussions was about, seriously, exactly what you talked about, that human touch, and that, like, particularly if you get a driver that services a particular warehouse or a particular company multiple times, it really doesn't matter at that point how the deal got done originally. How the service is offered and the relationships on a personal basis still do matter. You're just not going to strip that out. And that's one of the reasons why incumbency has power. You would think that if you went into like a digital operation, that the power of incumbency would disappear. But they made it clear that that's not the case.
And John, I kind of have to ask this question, of course, for our colleagues, Danny Gomez and Tyler Cole. Sounds like ESG was a bit of a talking point over there as well.
Very big talking point. And I didn't write on one of the sessions because it was just kind of very basic review. But it was interesting. That session I mentioned was run by Matt McClelland, who is a friend of FreightWaves with Covenant right there in Chattanooga. And I went into the meeting room where he was going to make a presentation on ESG. And let's review what ESG stands for: environmental, social, and governance. These are standards that companies are held to. And he had just gotten an email from a potential carrier, from a potential shipper client looking to do business with Covenant, and he read to the audience all the questions that were asked by this shipper. Do you have a standard on carbon? I won't go over the questions because I'll be doing it off the top of my head, which is always scary. But the kind of questions that you would imagine, what are your policies toward the environment? What are your policies toward diversity, et cetera, et cetera? And, remember something, the biggest shippers are generally big publicly traded companies, and even if they're not publicly traded, they're probably still adopting ESG principles. So if you've got a fleet of rust buckets that have huge carbon emissions, you're going to have to deal with it. That's going to affect a company's Scope 3 emissions. The Scope 3 emissions would be the emissions of companies you deal with. So if I'm a shipper, if I'm Home Depot, the emissions that are put out by the people carrying the goods to the Home Depot stores, away from the distribution centers out to the retail centers, that matters for my overall ESG score. And so nobody can hide from this anymore. This is not just some, loony thing that they do out in California anymore. This is getting very much down to the level of, it's going to affect your ability as a carrier to get business with some of these people. So you can't ignore it. And I would suggest that, it was kind of disappointing that at this session on ESG, it was a pretty empty room. And I would say that if you're a carrier right now, you better get up to speed on what ESG is, because you're going to find that when you go out there and bid for business, some shippers are going to start to ask you about it.
And it's not just that consumer now that's voting for these ESG principles with their dollars. You mentioned it is that shipper, which is that whole entire starting point of the supply chain. So interesting, John, to talk about that. If you've got one really good session from that you're looking forward to getting into, which one are you going to?
Well, I interviewed Relay Payments the other day, and today I'm interviewing RoadSync, which is a competitor. So I guess I got to put those two together, So anyway.
Side by side for transparency. I love it. Awesome, John. Thank you for joining us today. As always, we'll catch up with your MATS coverage. Have a good time, and tell Grace and Clarissa that we said hi as well.
Will do. Thank you.
All right, we're going to toss it over to Nick Austin for our first weather hit of the morning.